For centuries, humans have been growing alongside our botanical brethren. Our histories have mixed and mingled to bring us modern medical marvels, faded folklore, and everything in between. Of course, in order to understand the plant, we have to start with its roots. I'm M. Grubner Gaddis, and this is Rooted.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Lightly Rooted, a show where I answer a question that's been on my mind whether you've been wondering it or not, and I force you to do the research with me. Welcome to the unhinged corners of my brain. Some of you asked for this, and I'm doing my best to deliver, okay? Thank you again for being here. Such a joy to research with you. I promise we'll be doing plenty of regular Rooted episodes and launching some new content to make this up for you. But here we are answering yet another question, which I guess this week is not really so much of a question as it is just I need to know more about this, which is like plants in space. What's that about? What's it like to be a plant in space? Are we having fun up there with plants in space? Is the Martian, real? Could that happen? These are all great questions I don't know the answers to yet, but hopefully by the end of today's episode, we will know more. So without further ado, let's dig into it. Starting off, we're going to go ahead and go to the NASA page first, starting with their article called Exploration and Research, Growing Plants in Space. Alrighty, so for starters, they're just saying it's possible to grow plants in space as long as specifically what we're talking about right now is in super specific and controlled spaces like on the International Space Station, which can be really helpful because it's good for the psychological well-being in space for our astronauts, and it can be really important for keeping astronauts healthy on long-duration missions because it makes it possible to bring up certain things that are high in fresh nutrients, and also just we know being around plants can really help our mental health, which I'm sure being up in space can be really challenging. So an example they're giving right now is that a lack of vitamin C was all it took to give sailors scurvy and vitamin deficiencies, and it can cause a lot of really big problems. Packing multivitamins can't always be enough to keep our astronauts healthy while they're up there, because fresh produce does have much higher levels of some of these nutrients, and they can be easier for us to digest. So we're getting a lot more potent sources of those really key ingredients. Plus, I just can't imagine having to eat a bunch of freeze-dried meals and stuff all the time. I'm sure there's also a lot of psychological benefit to just being able to enjoy something that is a little bit not freeze-dried. So the idea there is that having plants on board would mean that maybe not all the time, but at least some of the time there might be some fresh produce, or at the very least just a little touch of home. But this is obviously really complicated just because it's not easy to, and I know this is crazy, it's really hard to replicate Earth in space. I know you guys think I'm crazy for saying that, but it's actually pretty complicated. So this has been an ongoing thing for them, and they have succeeded in growing some things. So they have something, the vegetable production system, which they just call veggie, which is kind of cute. And it's the garden that lives on the space station. So it helps them to just study plant growth in microgravity and does offer some fresh food for astronauts. And they're describing that it's the size of a carry-on piece of luggage, and it holds up to 6 plants. And each plant is given a little, they call them pillows. It's just a little grow bag, basically, that's filled with growth media and fertilizer. And the pillows help to give them each the right amount of water, nutrients, and air. Because, obviously, when we're talking about being in microgravity, gravity is not the same on the International Space Station as it is here. So if we're just, dumping water into the plants, either they're going to drown in the water, or the water is going to, bead up on the sides of other things. So plants are not going to be able to, drink that reasonably. It would kind of be instead of a nice little rain shower, basically you would be waterboarding the plants, or throwing big buckets of water on them every, year or so. in their minds, it would not be great, and it would be really bad. So they also have grow lights, obviously, to make sure that the plants are growing the way they're supposed to, and they're able to get nutrients, but we're also, because grow lights, and I know this is going to be a shocker too, are not the same as the sun, so they don't necessarily do the same job. That's why we're giving them supplemental fertilizer, just to make sure they are still getting all of the key nutrients. Kind of like, grow lights are not the same as Taco Bell, but it's kind of a similar analogy where, like, eating Taco Bell every day would keep you alive, but could we say you were happy and healthy? I don't know that to be true. I think probably not. And also, this is kind of a fun fact. So, plants look green to us because they're reflecting green light, right? We all remember this from science. We reflect the colors we can't absorb, and whichever one is the most is the one we look like to other things. But they use a lot of red and blue wavelengths. So, the veggie chamber on the International Space Station is just always like a Barbie magenta pink, which is kind of fun. And from what I'm seeing, it looks like they actually grow zinnias a lot as a test, and this isn't that surprising to me because when you look into what is regularly recommended for early gardeners, things like zinnias tend to be very easy to start from seed, and they're pretty consistent. Like, they're not super needy, they're pretty easy to study, and they're fairly responsive to stimuli without dying. So it doesn't really surprise me that that's kind of what they started with. But it says that so far, veggie has successfully grown things like lettuce, cabbage, mustard, kale, and zinnia. And then some of them we eat, well, we don't eat them, but the astronauts up there sometimes eat them, and then they also send them back just to see, like, what's going on with them. Are they growing like normal plants? Are there complications? Are there things we could be doing better? And one thing that people were really worried about was that there would be some kind of harmful space microbe growing on the produce. But so far, no one has died from eating space lettuce. It has been fairly uneventful. Now, they're moving into further testing where they're going to try things like tomatoes and peppers. And then, eventually, they'd really like to plant like berries and beans that can provide radiation protection and just generally kind of support the environment a little bit more on the space station, but those plants tend to be a little bit finickier, so I'm guessing it's going to take some time before they're able to fully pull that off. But that's like a fun little dive into veggie. And then they are doing more and more studies. So this is not on the International Space Station, it's actually on Earth, but it's what they're using to see, like, based on some different factors, how would these plants grow in space before we spend all of our time, money, resources trying it. It's called the Advanced Plant Habitat, or APH, and essentially what they've done is they've kind of sealed it off, and they've really limited what the different things are, or like the variables here. So it uses LED lights only and a porous clay substrate with controlled release fertilizer. So that's exactly what they're doing on veggie. But unlike veggie, so veggie's not closed off. It's still open to the air. They've actually closed this off, and they've added cameras and 180 sensors that are constantly giving information, relaying information, and intuiting information. So realistically, it's kind of like an automated greenhouse for these plants. People don't really touch it. It is highly controlled. And because of that, they're able to really limit variables to do proper experimentation for what things would be like in veggie or in different climates with different gases, all that kind of stuff. Okay, and they actually are using this in space. They started using it in spring 2018 using dwarf wheat, which is like a very common plant that we see experimented on a lot because wheat is a kind of grass, so it grows very quickly. It's not too picky. It can grow in dry climates, wet climates. It's just like it has very measurable reactions. It's just like a pretty basic thing, and it's not super expensive to grow or obtain. And one of the big things they were studying here is what happens to plants in space on like a genetic
level. So, like, does their makeup change at all? And if so, how is it changing? Why is it changing? And they really want to understand what plant lignin, what is happening to that in microgravity. So it's kind of like what's happening in the bones. And we know, right, when astronauts go into space, their bones do change a little bit. Is the same thing happening to plants? And if so, why? What's going on with that? Is it because... So in humans, like, astronauts, when they come back, they've lost bone mass, they've lost muscle mass, and that's because they're not fighting against gravity as much, we think. So they just haven't had to, like, really use as much force. So the question there would be, is the same thing true for plants, and do they react in the same way? And the answer is that we don't know, we're still studying it. This is where I feel like science teases me so often, because they'll ask me a really interesting question, and they're basically like, tune in next week to find out. And like, I want to know right now. But other people are doing interesting stuff too. It's fine. A lot of people are still just studying, like, what happens to them, how are they reacting to stimuli in space versus Earth. So, like, do plants in space still get cold shock in the same way plants on Earth do? Does it happen faster? Does it take longer? Do they respond to touch in the same way? Are they screaming if their leaves get cut off? Do they respond the same way to being watered too much as they would on Earth? Those kinds of things. And so they're still studying this. This is an ongoing study. Again, we haven't necessarily seen anything crazy yet, other than plants do seem to be more reactive to stress from oxidation than normal plants on Earth would be. And normally plants on Earth are really reactive to oxygen-based chemicals, again, because they're trying to release oxygen all the time. Oxygen is all around them. They don't necessarily like it. But in healthy plants, the cells just kind of deal with it. And they're just kind of like, I don't love that, but whatever. In space, though, plants are making more, like, stress hormones. So, essentially, like, they're getting kind of sick. They think, like, when you go into space, plants, their immune system's a little bit more compromised, okay? Like, it's kind of the equivalent of if you send adults who don't have children into a kindergarten classroom for a week or something. Definitely not speaking from experience here or anything, but usually those adults feel awful for a good solid week and a half or 2 weeks. Sometimes more than that if you're lucky enough to go to the mountains with them. Sometimes it just really takes you out. And so that's the equivalent of what's happening to those plants. But other than that, we're not seeing anything too crazy. Like maybe a weakened immune system, but their reactions to other stimulus so far have been pretty normal. And when they come back to Earth, they tend to bounce back. So we're not necessarily seeing something where, like, if you take a plant to Earth or to space and then bring it back, it's going to die instantaneously. Certainly if you're not, like, careful with it, it could, I'm assuming, get transplant shock just like any other kind of plant, but we aren't seeing a huge difference in the way that they react to stimuli. But obviously that's going to be ongoing. We haven't been in space that long, so just like anything else in science, the longer time goes on, the more we'll know. Moving on from what's going on up there, let's talk about plants that have been to space. Let's do that. We're going to astro-botany.com. I have to tell you guys, this does not look like a reliable website, but it might also just be that it's giving such a hard 90s, early 2000s vibe and hasn't been updated since then. I'm going to see if I can find out when it was last updated. Because I'm telling you right now, it's giving 90s. Which isn't bad. Copyright 2024. Okay, this is just how it looks. I'm sorry. They have a TikTok. I'm sorry for the things that I said, astrobotany.com. The vibe is just throwing me, but I'm sure you're great. Okay, so far in space, we've grown Theocrest, which is, like, helpful because it's got a short life cycle, it's small, and it can give us a lot of data. So when we're trying to study the growth patterns of plants, this guy is a heavy hitter for us. And then we're growing in and that started in, what is nice about this is, okay, they're giving us lots of good data. I'm sorry for the things I said, astrobotany. This started in 1982 on an aircraft from Russia. And then the next thing they are talking about is stiff brome, which is a kind of grass
Dr. Patrick Masson of the University of Madison, Wisconsin, started growing this in 2018 on the International Space Station. They've also been growing field mustard, which is interesting to me because around here that is very much invasive. But it is tasty. It's kind of like a cross between bok choy and Napa cabbage. Okay, it was grown on the Russian space station in 1997 between NASA and the Russian Space Agency. Again, Wisconsin coming in with this plant education, but I'm not seeing why it was selected to be grown. It just was. I'm wondering if, again, it was just kind of one of those, like, we've got a lot of this and it grows rigorously on Earth. Let's see what happens. And then they germinated spores of the triangle water fern in 1999, and Colombia did that. Sometimes it's saying why and sometimes it's not, so we're just going to have to accept that. And then China grew cotton on the surface of the moon in 2019. Hold on, I didn't know that. Okay, well, they're using successfully loosely because it sounds like it sprouted and then shriveled up and died, but it was the first astro-botany experiment on the surface of the moon, and it was kind of fun because they used sunlight from space. So, like, they weren't setting up a bunch of grow lights or anything. Sounds like it was very much like, could we do this? And the answer was like, kinda, sorta. Like, I'm a little upset I didn't hear about this, but I don't know. Did you guys hear about them growing cotton on the moon? That's crazy town to me. What the heck? Okay. Catgrass was grown on the Space Shuttle Discovery just to see how microgravity would impact grasses. And then they did it again just to be like, okay, we brought catgrass up here and it lived, but what would happen if we tried to start it from seed? And it turns out the same thing. And then they did barrel clover. That was on the International Space Station again. They did it first in 2011 to see if the microbiome host would interact. So again, clover is part of the legume family. And I know we've talked about this before, but I'm not sure if you were there or not. Actually, the legume family forms little partnerships with bacteria in the soil to be able to have that bacteria bring nitrogen into the soil because plants can't absorb it from the air. So they make like a little Breaking Bad later season deal where they're like, if you guys move in and you make all of the nitrogen that we want, we will give you a safe space where you do not have to worry about the police or Homeland Security or whatever. But in this case, the police is oxygen. And they're like, okay, deal. And so they do that all the time. So at first they were like, does that still happen in the soil here? And then in 2022, they were like, let's just see what happens in soil health here. Let's try it again. Magnitude.io was like, we're really interested in space soil now. Presumably because Elon Musk has that whole thing where he wants to colonize Mars or whatever. And so they were like, could we make the soil on Mars like the soil on Earth? And they're using barrel clover to try because it's so tiny. Okay, purslane, which if you're from where I am, this stuff is everywhere. And again, Magnitude.io was just like, how does this work? If you don't know, purslane is a little baby succulent, and it really doesn't need anything. Out here where I'm from, I swear to you, the earth has been salted. And purslane is she'll pop up anywhere. She's not picky. We never get any rain. We don't do anything to help her out. And yeah, she still comes back year after year. She is a force to be reckoned with. And she's edible. She's packed with a lot of really helpful nutrients. So it's kind of one of those, like, is she the tastiest? I'm not going to lie to you. No, she's not. But if you're in a survival situation, this is a good thing to be on the lookout for because it's really easy to get a hold of. So again, if you're trying to colonize Mars and you don't know what would work, I guess purslane. Also, they've tried white spruce trees. Wowee, I didn't know that. 2010 International Space Station, they grew it on the ABRS spaceflight research tool. It was between NASA and CSA, and it was to help researchers understand how trees make wood. I'm kind of unclear about why we had to go to space for that, but, love that for us. And then now we're moving into, like, what are the plants that we're growing for astronauts to eat in space? Which I'm always curious because I'm like, what are they eating out there? And what have we decided is, like, this is good for you. This is worth growing for you. Have a little tasty treat on us. I want to know.
And also, astronauts, do you get tired of eating this produce, or is this like you love it for life? So first is Mizuna lettuce. They started growing this, it says 2010, but they also started it partially because it's a really good lettuce, so it's good for them to eat it and get the nutrients that it has. But it's also partially helpful with water uptake and fertilizer. So that was one of the reasons they did it. Also, Espanola improved chili peppers. They have a 120-day growing time. I'm guessing it was just to add like a little bit of flavor, and also because chili peppers are in the same family as tomatoes and tobacco, and so they can tell us a lot. We do a lot of experiments on them because they have like very, I want to say, grabbable. This is where it really shows that I'm not actually a scientist, but their DNA is easy to study the changes in, so I'm guessing that was also a helpful fun fact. And then zucchini, grown in a plastic bag using aeroponics, and they only watered it with a fine mist, and it was just to help reduce the water but still produce fruit. Astronaut Donald Pettit has a blog about growing a space zucchini. We're reading that, and they used a Ziploc bag, proving that you don't have to be fancy to do science, you just have to try. And I love that for us. Okay, we're going to look into that, or at least I am, I don't know. And then again, wheat, we already covered that. Red romaine lettuce, mini romaine lettuce, red Russian kale. Why are we growing so much kale? Rice. They tried rice. That's kind of fun. Shout out Nebraska. A student from there did that just to see, like, how does it react to gravity when it's trying to grow and put on roots. But that's kind of fun. We've done tomatoes apparently a bunch of times. And in 2023, we grew tomatoes in space and sent them back to Earth. And then we've also been sending tomatoes up there for them. So that's kind of nice. Spinach, broccoli, radish, onions. And fun fact, onions were the first ones that they ever ate. I'm assuming because freeze-dried food probably isn't necessarily the tastiest. And they were like, please flavor. So onions in 1971 were some of the first food to be eaten in space that we grew in space. And then also soybeans were grown, plus just some pretty plants. It seems like, shout out Don Pettit. I want to be friends. This man's just doing biology experiments in space as like a casual. He's an astronaut and a farmer. Don Pettit, you're the best. And Scott Kelly, I guess in 2016 also did this, which is fun, but I feel like Don Pettit seems like he's getting more into it. So we're going into his little blog right now. It's called Letters to Earth, Astronaut Don Pettit, Diary of a Space Zucchini, January 5th, 2012. I sprouted, thrust into this world without anyone consulting me. I'm not one of the beautiful. I'm not one by any other name that instills flutters in the human heart. I'm the kind that makes little boys gag at the dinner table, thus being sent to bed without their dessert. I am utilitarian, hardy vegetative matter that can thrive under harsh conditions. I'm a zucchini, and I'm in space. January 7th. I become aware of my fellow crewmates for the first time. It takes a sprout a few days before grasping your surroundings. One is my gardener, who waters my roots every day. I overheard that we're in a spacecraft orbiting Earth and are part of a long space mission. As crew, I'm not sure of my role, but I'm ready to contribute in any way that I can. January 9th. I discovered that my roots are bound in a Ziploc bag. This bag has a canoe-shaped piece of closed cellular foam wedged in the opening that retains the needed moisture. My stem is held in place by a piece of scrap spongy material called a pig mat. Used for absorbent packing for spacecraft supplies, pig mat will soak up spillage from liquid containers. It makes a nice transition between the stuffy closed cell foam and my green parts, and will keep nasty mold away from my stem. This is most definitely not hydroponics. My roots are not submerged in a bag of water. This bag is mostly filled with air and has only a small amount of water neatly tucked into the corners from the action of capillary forces and weightlessness. This is aeroponics, a rather new method for raising plants without soil and without large volumes of water. Only a small amount is needed, just enough to keep my roots at 100% humidity and make up for what I drink. My roots are not sealed in this bag. They have access to gas exchange with the cabin air. My roots are thus exposed in this transparent bag, naked to the universe. Embarrassed, it took me a few days to get over the idea that everyone can see my roots without any dirt covering them. January 10th. I reach for the light. It burns brightly. There's a small plastic bag loosely set over my top that keeps the humidity high for my tender new leaves. My roots are another matter. They sense sourness, the kind that makes one want to tiptoe across the floor for fear of getting something on your feet. But for now, it does not matter. I'm living off the nutrients in my seed pod. My cotyledons, like a drogue chute in the parachute deployment sequence, provide the photosynthetic nourishment until my real leaves can form. Now I stretch my first leaf and orient it towards the light. Soon my other leaves will wilt. The plastic bag cover was removed by my gardener. January 14th. My gardener fusses with me several times a day. He checks that I have water, light, and with a hypodermic syringe, injects this tea concoction into the Ziploc bag. It bathes my roots with a not-so-tasty drink. However, it does seem to contain the nutrients I need. I won't complain. On expeditions into the frontier, the food is, unfortunately, often this way. This is, very long. By January 18th, the little seedling is 15 centimeters high and has 4 leaves. He's really happy and green, and he's still getting tea. They make this tea out of compost, so it's paper scraps, orange peels, garlic skins, apple cores, and leftovers that they blend up, plus packets of freeze-dried green beans that compost well, and then a little bit of dirt. Then they wet it up after they've ground it up, and they give it to him. And it's working. And then they're kind of describing that there's different kinds of light, and so they're shifting it, and they're helping it to make sure that it doesn't keep them up at night, but also them being the crew, but also it's feeding the little plant. And then now other people are getting involved, other astronauts are also starting to kind of fall in love with the plant, which is pretty cute. And this is on January 24th, so literally within less than a month, people are finally being like, oh my gosh, what a little cutie, I'll vacuum out the HEPA filter, oh my gosh, we love him, he can have a call sign. Oh, to be a plant on the International Space Station. So this little plant has the call sign Rose, if anyone wondered. So then they're talking about the light, it's switching up a lot, so they do 16 short periods of light every day, and they only do that every 24 hours. So it's kind of confusing the plant, and it's not growing as well. So then they're moving him around to see, will this work any better? And that's helping a little bit, because it's giving it more consistent life throughout the craft. By February 1st, it's putting on flowers, and then it's continuing to grow flowers, and now it's blooming. We're at February 14th. Aww. The astronaut calls his partner and shows her the little zucchini blossom and says, this is for you. That's very sweet. This is about to make me cry, so we have to skip it. Oh no! They never got zucchinis, you guys, because we haven't talked about this on the podcast yet, but zucchinis only make, they don't necessarily make male and female flowers. Sometimes you'll get a plant that only makes male flowers, and sometimes only female flowers, and unfortunately, the zucchini only made male flowers, so they didn't have anything that could even produce a zucchini. So there were no space zucchinis. Kinda sad. But still kind of fun. And with that, I feel like we're not going to get a more accurate depiction of what it's like to be a plant in space. So with that, I think we'll cut it here. Thank you to that astronaut for really making sure we got it from the plant's POV. Appreciate you. And I will see you guys next time for another week of tomfoolery at some point, where we dive into tall tales and true facts about plants. See you then.
Until next time, be kind to yourselves, be kind to the earth, and just like a plant, drink your water. If you liked the show, please subscribe and consider leaving us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else you listen. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram at rooted.pod. We're finally updating regularly on YouTube at rooted.podcast, and you can check out our website, rootedpod.com, for transcripts, updates, merch, and so much more. The show is written, produced, and hosted by me. I'm Grebner Gaddis, edited by Kat Friend of Friend Diagram, and our theme music was written and produced by Eric Cluxon. Rooted is a Henbane Media LLC production.